This week we have the topic of teachers' work. In this we want to look at how we as professionals interact with the work environment and how the work environment reacts or interacts with us as professionals. Key things that I want to mention, and one of them is the notion of stress. Now, stress is something that often gets put aside. We're becoming a lot more accepting and open and talking about mental illness and stress. But stress is something that is really prevalent in the workplace, particularly in teaching. It is unfortunately one of the professions with the highest rate of stress, and one of the main reasons teachers are off work for a long period of time is to do with workplace stress. So we want to raise this as an issue just to make you aware of it. Now, the key thing with stress, as a couple of the quotes coming here from the UK, which had a really good system for this, is that stress is a mismatch between your expectations and your ability to live out those expectations in real life. The key point is be mindful of what your expectations are as a teacher and have a role in managing those expectations, speaking out about them and managing your workload. It means sort of on day one you can't change the world, but you can change the world over a career. Probably one of the key things you see with early career teachers who leave their profession is that sense of I couldn't do what I wanted to do. But there's often also there a case of I was trying to do everything I wanted to do in 1 year rather than over the 30 years of my potential career. So we've got to balance these things. And you've all done Maslow's, for example, and I put this in these sort of slides just to sort of remind you of that Ed Foundations type work, on early Ed Psych type work, where there's the hierarchy of needs. Well, that actually applies to you guys too. Right? It's not just for students. If you guys aren't functioning, aren't achieving your needs, aren't engaged actively in the work that you're doing, but aren't having your broader social needs met, then your likelihood of teaching effectively is diminished. So we want to keep these ideas of stress is real, it happens, but if you're aware of it and manage it and seek assistance when you need it, then you diminish it. And also, your needs are important, and they come equally as important as the students, because if yours aren't being met, then the students' learning needs are definitely not being met. Look, when it comes to thinking about stress, a couple of categories of thoughts here that you can come and have a look at in the slides in a little bit more detail later on. But things like the ability to manage change, having clear roles, demands and expectations that can be managed, having the appropriate support, and having good positive relationships with people whom you work with. This all comes down to recognition that, and you hear a lot from the teaching profession, that there are so many demands and pressures on them now and accountability, and that does manifest itself in teacher stress. But it's also about recognising that these are the pressure points. So being clear on what are the demands on you as a new teacher, having a good relationship with your head or lead teacher, discussing issues of change, whose roles, what roles, and having a lot of clarity around what you're doing. Don't just assume things. Make sure it's clear, written down and defined. Now, I want to move on here now to the key work of Christopher Day. The main study was in 2006, but he's done many since. And also related to this is the work of Jean Clendenin in Canada, which shows a lot of similarities to Christopher Day's work in the UK. And they're talking here about teachers' careers and effectiveness. So, key point I want to point out is this sort of middle one here, I guess, in that effectiveness, we'll talk about the top one first. Effectiveness is understood in relation to a teacher's perception and how they vary over time. And we talked about place and we talked about context. And you can see here that in this work, different institutional and personal contexts impact a teacher's effectiveness. That relates to how well their needs in the Maslow sense are being met, how well their professional objectives are being met and they're achieving those, but also different institutions have different influences on that. Then it comes down to the teacher's capacities, and they're influenced by variations in work lives and identities. So what am I getting at here? I'm getting at things like professional life phases. If I look at this work that came out of Day, you can see here these are years into the profession. So 0 to 3 years, 4 to 7, 9 to 11, and so forth. What they found in this study was that in different phases of their professional work, what made a teacher effective changed. And they were effective at different times and in different ways throughout their career. So in an early first 3 years, teachers are really focusing on nailing that job as a teacher. Understandable, you probably have those similar concerns. Get into the 4 to 7 year phase and teachers are sort of going, okay, I've got the teaching down pat now pretty much. Why am I here? What brought me to teaching? And that's where people start to think about, well, am I achieving my objectives? That's where stress comes into it and questions around whether it was a career choice and so forth. As it goes on, things like, well, people having relationships, having their own children, having parents that are older and maybe dying and having health needs, children growing up and problems with that, changing into a leadership role, etc. Changing schools. These all create new demands and changes. And what makes a teacher effective in each of those is different. It's not just one form of effectiveness over life, and that life has an impact on teaching. So it's just bringing a balance between those things. In some ways, maybe potentially unhelpful, I guess, is that this sort of work shows us that some of the stuff we talk about in this unit, in the first couple of years of teaching, well, you're worried about looking after your class. But after a few years, it's like, why am I in this again? And some of the stuff we talk about comes into that 4 to 7 phase. There's also recognising that effectiveness changes as you change schools and roles, but also you do have pressures, work-life pressures, etc., which then challenge your ability. Key thing for you guys hitting the ground next year as new teachers, keep in mind this notion of commitment that they found. They found that early career teachers can often be more effective than longer career teachers. Okay? But also, we need to guard against burnout. We need to cope with the challenges of the work and maintain effectiveness over the long term. Okay, so that's the thing again of not trying to meet every demand in the first year, or that notion of you're going to make a difference for that child. Yes, you are, but you got to weigh up with making a difference for 1 or 2 children in a few years, or a whole lot of children over a career. Identity comes into this. So you will form a sense of professional identity, and a strong and positive sense of identity is really important. If you are finding, for instance, that the pressures outside of school or the expectations upon you or even some personal issues are impacting your identity and your ability to think that you're being an effective teacher, then that can have 2 outcomes. It can have an outcome, a negative effect and a positive effect. So what they're saying here is the data they did, and they studied thousands of students and teachers and looked at the relationship between teachers' identity senses and student achievement and standardized tests, and they found that when a teacher's identity was positive, the students were actually getting positive effects on their learning. When a teacher's professional identity was negative, the students were getting negative effects on their learning. So what this tells us in a good data study is, hey look, we've got to be mindful of how we manage our expectations and how we maintain a strong sense of professional identity and guard against things that diminish that. Another important work here, and we used it earlier in the unit, is Connell's notion of a good teacher. That notion that what a good teacher is changes over time. And this has an effect on identity. Because if you have a view of a good teacher as being, say, the scholar teacher or the competent teacher, these change over time. So we need to be mindful that identity in the public policy sense shifts. And that's where a lot of teachers in the last 15 years have found the change in accountability and regulation problematic, because it's not what they went into teaching for instance. But then they find new ways to assert their professional identity and take control of their work. Not just be responsive, but to take ownership. And that's the key message here. Public policy changes, but you need to maintain ownership in your work. The other thing Connell talks about is this stuff down the bottom here, that teaching is work. Okay? It is a form of intellectual labour. It's not just something you do as a vocation. We need to be mindful of the language that we use. When we talk about teaching as a caring profession or a vocation, then we diminish its professionalism. Okay, it's not the same sort of intellectual work. It's not the same sort of labour, and intellectual labour. It's more about affect and care. Those things have an impact in downgrading the profession. They become sort of lower quality discourses and aren't aligned with, say, high pay. 2 quick things I'll mention then about challenge. Susan Rice did a really cool study in Melbourne and basically found that, while you might think teachers seek out nice, cushy schools, actually the teachers that were most effective and had really strong sense of professional identity and who they were actually sought out really difficult schools because they felt they could make a difference, really have a sense of purpose, roll their sleeves up and try new and innovative things. So there's a notion there of where is the best school for someone to work in. just drawing in out of some of this other stuff from the rural work that I have been involved with, this study in the New South Wales Department found that, well, when things are implemented locally, so coming back to the idea of place and context, then there was a really positive effect on the circumstances of teachers and the way they talked about it, but also schools and school achievement. So all this stuff that we've been talking about around context, place, identity, it all comes together to form a sense of, when we do these things positively in relation to contexts with a strong sense of purpose, then teachers' identity is high, which we know links to good outcomes, but also student learning is high, which follows from that previous point. So in the context of the environment that we find ourselves in, there's a couple of notions that come in useful, and I think Judy Sachs, activist professional, might be one. She's not talking here about placards and manning the ramparts and marching on the street. What she's talking about is a teacher, an activist professional is someone who takes control over the profession, takes responsibility for it. And this work was happening around the time of professional standards. And she drew the distinction between teacher and teaching standards. In that, if we talk about standards as teacher standards, then they're about individuals and measuring performance and regulatory. When we talk about teaching standards, they're for the profession, they focus on pedagogy, and they improve teaching. Now, we have the professional teaching standards by AITSL, but it's a matter of whether they're used as teaching standards or teacher standards. So language is really important there. This key point, though, of professionals gaining control over professional work, or as she talks about, it's not just competent in the Connell sense, it's about intellectual labour, it's active collaboration, it's about reconnecting knowledge and practice. Okay, it's informed professionalism. All these things align with some of the historical work Connell was talking about, but then align with the sense of taking ownership and identity and control to have a sense of what is your professional identity, as we've looked at, which leads to better student outcomes, not negative student outcomes, rather than, in the sort of stress sense, being response to outside things, not having control, not having a change management, and not having the appropriate support. So the point of this week really is that teachers have many roles. All this stuff comes together. It's important to understand that teaching is a form of work, which therefore implies certain rights. It has professional work, which implies certain ownership and control by that you're in it. But there's also a tension with public policy environments, so there's a need to maintain control over those. But equally, it's important to remember that you are also a human being. Your life is not devoted solely to the children that you teach. You are a person, and you need to be in control of your own life and positively engaged in that to be the effective teacher that I imagine everyone wants to be.